So we've talked about microevolution, we've talked about mutation and migration, selection and genetic drift or chance things. And we will talk about macroevolution, where we have multiple species diverging from one another and giving rise to new species on their own. But what connects microevolution with the macroevolution is the speciation event itself. And speciation events, the number one thing that speciation involves is something called reproductive isolation. So speciation is a result of selection for reproductive isolation between populations that otherwise are in regular contact. If you have two populations and they can't exchange genes and they're different species, that's it. That's what a speciation means. In fact, that's the biological species concept. You have two populations that within the population, they're much more able to exchange genes than between the two populations. You have two species. Doesn't mean they look different from one another. They have to have a little bit of difference so they're not exchanging genes. But they don't have to be profoundly different morphologically or anatomically in order to be two different species. When you have speciation, you can generate a single new species from an old species. You can generate more than one new species from an old species. And all of this speciation is basically a consequence of selection against hybridization, which is another way of saying selection for, in fact, the for is right there. In fact, the selection's right there. Selection for reproductive isolation. And so we'll go through these ideas. So this is a very simple way of representing just what speciation is. We have two populations that really are not separate from one another. These could be two different subspecies. They really are not so separate that they would be considered to be different species from one another. There's still a lot of gene exchange that's going on between them. But you can have separation of the gene pools to the point where the overlap between the two populations is much, much less, such that the potential for gene exchange, genes, alleles from this population literally migrating into that population is much lower, despite the fact that migration, at least in theory, could occur. And at this point, we are really talking about a situation where you have two different species. And if the gene pools don't overlap at all, so there's very, very little movement of alleles between the two populations, even given the possibility of such movement. Even if the two populations live in the same area, then you clearly have two different species. So speciation is very much tied up to what is a species, and what is a species is very much tied up with what the capability of alleles of moving from one population to another. If that possibility is low, despite opportunity, then the two populations represent two different species. If you have a single population that gets split up into two populations, and those two populations become unable to easily exchange genes, you have two separate species now, and therefore you've had a speciation event. So this, in a sense, is a representation of a speciation event. You could have started out here with a population that's simply one cohesive population. Here it's two subpopulations, but they're still in substantial communication in terms of migration and alleles. Here we have two populations that are in much less communication, to the point where really alleles are not very effectively moving between the two populations. And we can, at this point, even though we have hybridization going on, call the two populations different species. And here we don't even have hybridization going on, and it's clearly we've got two populations that represent different species. And so that's why I started all this out by saying, don't play hard to get. So this is a Heidi-Weinberg assumption. So the reverse of that would be play hard to get. And by playing hard to get, what I mean is you've got these mechanisms, reproductive isolation mechanisms, barriers, that get put into place in order to prevent the production of hybrid progeny that otherwise are not as effective as their parents. And once you've put into place these mechanisms that prevent individuals from mating or prevent matings from being successful in producing progeny, you essentially have separated two gene pools, and this separation of gene pools is essentially the definition of speciation. So these are our various types of isolation mechanisms, barriers to reproduction. The ones that are below here are post-conception or post-zygotic barriers. So these are the various barriers that give rise to, their essence is giving rise to hybrid progeny that are less fit than the parents of those crosses. So reduced hybrid viability means the offspring don't survive as effectively. Reduced hybrid fertility means that the offspring are less effective in producing progeny themselves. And then something called hybrid breakdown is where it's not the immediate progeny, but the grandchildren that are less reproductively successful. So these all represent a lowered fitness associated with the progeny of hybridizations. And since it's costly to the parents to produce offspring that have a lowered fitness, you have selection for avoidance of producing those offspring. And that selection gives rise to these pre-zygotic barriers. So if you should have a mutation that interferes with mating between populations, then that will be selected for to prevent the production of these hybrid progeny that display lowered fitness. And we've been through a number of these. So gametic isolation is where the gametes just don't tend to fuse together, so fertilization doesn't occur even if the gametes encounter one another. But in order to have gametic isolation to even take place, you have to have some equivalent of mating going on so that the gametes are given an opportunity to get together. Although often you see gametic isolation going on in species that simply release their sperm and their egg into the environment, so that essentially the only means by which they could keep egg from combining with sperm is if there's an incompatibility between the two. This, above all, prevents a wasting of eggs, because eggs are the more expensive of the gametes. So if you have an egg that basically blocks the sperm that is of a type that's a different subspecies or different species, that egg will not turn into a zygote that then has reduced viability. So it's a way of preventing these eggs from being lost to less productive fertilizations. Mechanical isolation means that you've got some mechanism that keeps the actual mating process from occurring so that the gametes are never released so that they're not wasted. Temporal isolation means that you're not mating at the same times during the year, during the day, and as a consequence, you don't have a situation where mating is even attempted. Behavioral isolation means that you have two individuals that perhaps are attempting to mate at the same time, but they're not giving each other the same cues that would lead to a mating. And this works out as a way of identifying members of your own species before, in fact, mating takes place. But it also is a means by which individuals within a species can identify or distinguish between potential mates in terms of their evolutionary fitness, what kind of genes those mates are going to potentially bring to the mating. Habitat isolation is a little bit different, and that's because there are substantial reasons to occupy different habitats, two subspecies or two populations to occupy different habitats other than just reproductive isolation. And that's because essentially if you're existing in a slightly different niche, you're exploiting different resources, and so you don't have as much competition between populations. But a byproduct of that is that if you're in a subtly different habitat, you may not, especially if you're small enough, even if you're occupying the same range, two populations may never come in contact or come in contact relatively little, and therefore opportunities for mating may be much lower, and therefore the potential for producing a hybrid progeny is much lower. And then it all starts out with geographical isolation. And geographical isolation is different from the rest of these in that it does not have a genetic basis. But nevertheless, that is the key first step in the formation of new species. You have to have some means by which two populations are separated from one another so in fact they can diverge and then ultimately give rise to situations where if matings are attempted, the progeny have a reduced fitness of in some capacity. They may diverge and then attempt hybridization and not show a reduced fitness in the progeny, in which case you will not get selection for these prezygotic barriers, in which case you won't have a speciation event located in that. So all of these ideas are happening within the context of geographical barriers. But rather than, although I illustrate it as being you basically split a population in two, a better way of thinking about geographical barriers is that they're a means by which peripheral populations are cut off from the main population. So you can think of a main population as being this group of organisms. They're mostly able to interact with one another, but you have a little bit of the edges of these populations that may be invading slightly different niches, and within these slightly different niches, they may be experiencing slightly different levels of selection. So they might be slightly different from the parent population, or at least have the potential to be slightly different from the parent population. And if these isolates, or I should say if these peripheral populations or subpopulations should be cut off from the main population by some kind of barrier, suddenly what you have is a peripheral isolate. And a peripheral isolate, if it starts out small, if it has slightly different allele frequencies because it, for example, has been occupying a slightly different niche, there might also be founder effects. You've got all sorts of potential for these populations to display some kind of genetic divergence from the parental population. If they stay small, you could have genetic bottlenecking. You could have selection for greater divergence if, in fact, once cut off, these populations experience even greater differences in what their environment's like. Without the genes flowing back and forth, particularly from the main population to this one, this population by migration is not going to stay as similar as it would have before it gets cut off to the main population. So you've got all sorts of potential for divergence in those populations. And that cutting off of these peripheral isolates and then the resulting potential for divergence is the first step towards this potential for speciation. So this is another way of showing it. So you've got some population, everybody in the population can mate with one another. And then you impose some kind of geographical barrier like a mountain or what have you. Suddenly you've broken up the population into two parts or more parts. And now there's no longer a potential because of geographical reasons for the population to, an individual A to mate with individual B. And as I said, this typically occurs within the context of these peripheral populations rather than necessarily splitting the population down the center, and starts the process towards divergence of the two populations genetically. This idea of not playing hard to get, which we talked about in terms of sexual selection, is also crucial for speciation. Speciation is all about having reproduction occurring that doesn't involve that doesn't involve random mating, that involves non-random mating. So you have species that are mating preferentially within their populations rather than between populations. And once you have that preferential mating occurring to the point where it's only occurring within populations rather than between two populations, then those two populations are considered to be separate species. So we have a lot of reproductive isolation mechanisms, and these are different means by which the potential for mating between two members, one from two different populations, is reduced. And we not arbitrarily distinguish these different mechanisms into postzygotic, which means post-conception, and prezygotic mechanisms. A really important one is geographical isolation up there because that starts off the whole process, seemingly in many cases. But you can also have a number of different prezygotic mechanisms that all have the equivalent result of not resulting in the formation of a zygote. You also have a number of postzygotic mechanisms, and all of these represent a reduced fitness of a hybrid zygote relative to its parents. And what happens in speciation is that the prezygotic mechanisms, except for geographical isolation, and particularly behavioral, temporal, mechanical, and gametic isolation, are selected by a reduced fitness associated with the hybrids. In other words, if you're a guy and you're a girl and you get together and have a baby, and that baby either dies or isn't able to grow up and reproduce, then that's going to select against that mating. And if you can come up, there's a genetic basis for why those two individuals are producing offspring that are not themselves reproductively successful. If you can come up with a mechanism that prevents that mating from happening, then you can prevent the low fertility or survival of that offspring. And that's essentially what speciation is. You've got these mechanisms where individuals are less capable of reproducing because of genetic bases, and evolution selects against the production of those individuals. So you have postzygotic mechanisms selecting for prezygotic mechanisms. And it all begins, at least as the story is usually told, with a geographical barrier. That would be a mountain. So you have a single population, and that population is split into two, or it could be split into more than two, by some kind of barrier. It could be a river, could be an ocean, could be a mountain, could be a canyon. And as a consequence, the two populations are no longer able to communicate back and forth in terms of migration. Individuals are no longer able to move between the two populations. It doesn't mean the two populations are different species. If you took away this mountain, or if you simply grabbed a handful of individuals over here and moved them over here, they probably would be able to successfully mate, because the two populations, at least at this stage, have not necessarily developed these prezygotic or even postzygotic isolation then. So to summarize, this is what speciation is all about. You have a geographical barrier or some other mechanism by which you have a separation of gene pools so that you don't have migration that keeps the gene pools similar to one another. This gives rise to what are termed postzygotic barriers if the two populations should attempt mating, which means basically that you have a reduced fitness of the hybrid progeny of those matings. And that in turn selects for prezygotic barriers, which are barriers to mating. And of course, this is a packet of birth control pills. It's the best I could come up with. And that's the best I could come up with for a hybrid progeny that has a reduced level of fitness. I mean, there's something wrong with this guy. So it's just that basic idea, some means that the gene pools are separated. When the gene pools have the opportunity to no longer be separated, their attempts are not very effective, and that leads for prevention of those attempts. And once you have prevention of those attempts that are highly effective, you essentially have two different species. So that's the easy way of showing that idea. This is the complicated way that includes all sorts of concepts of microevolution, although it's not really highlighting the various microevolution processes like genetic drift and migration and mutation and selection. So what you have is some population, which I'm calling a parental population. You have some kind of barrier that splits this population into two. Typically, that would result in the formation of a peripheral isolate, but it doesn't mean we've lost the parental population. You then have chance events, which is what's considered here under stochasticity, and you have deterministic events, which is basically natural selection. And these give rise to some degree of divergence of the population. So this would be divergence of the peripheral isolate population from the parental population. Now, just going back words for just a touch as an aside, there's not just one peripheral isolate. There are many, many, many peripheral isolates over long periods of time. And most of those peripheral isolates go extinct, which is why I've got the arrow pointing towards extinction. So that's the fate of almost everything that attempts to diverge, is extinction. So it can be going through this stochastic and deterministic genetic divergence, but in all likelihood, it's going to go extinct. Genetic divergence can give rise to phenotypic divergence, but in all likelihood, the population is going to go extinct. When you start getting this phenotypic divergence, as well as genetic divergence, you can have a reduced potential for successful hybridization with the parent population. So those are your postzygotic barriers. So speciation, if it occurs, is occurring somewhere in here. The point where you're kind of having selection for a lack of hybridizations. But once again, there's a high likelihood that extinction is going to occur in this former peripheral isolated population. But if the isolate persists and otherwise is successful, you'll have this accumulation of adaptations, and that could allow this population to expand its niche or expand its range to essentially become a legitimate population unto itself, which then could serve as a parental population for peripheral isolates, and the process can continue and continue and continue. So you've got these populations in all likelihood have done most of their evolving and genetic divergence as small isolated populations. They can form, if they're lucky, into large populations that we can describe as parental populations. And those large populations themselves can throw off peripheral isolates, which can go on to be new species, new populations, and so on and so forth. And in the course of all of this, you have an accumulation of adaptations, and those adaptations give you the impression, to a large extent correct, that over time, the species that are found on Earth are becoming more effective and sophisticated in terms of their ability to survive and also to reproduce.